And welcome everybody to Revit Online, lesson 1. I've got a couple slides to go through and then we're going to jump straight into Revit. So the key goal for today is to get you guys started in Revit to be able to start your own new project and have a bit of a click around over the next 7 days and just familiarize yourself with Revit. So the course goal is to give you the foundations in navigating your way around and the confidence to explore further from anywhere you like. So we've got some interior designers and architects in the group. The idea is that by the end of this course, you'll have a pretty good foundation to decide on which part of Revit you want to focus on and how you can use the tool in your work or your projects. For those that aren't familiar, I'm going to first introduce a little bit about Revit, what it looks like and what you can do with it. So here we've got just a simple Revit model, which we're going to have a look at in a minute. The course outlines is no doubt going to change over the next couple of days, but basically we're going to look at over 6 lessons. Firstly, starting a Revit project. And the second lesson, we're going to look at the 3D side of Revit. So creating and modifying like the big elements. So like walls, floors, roofs, ceilings, what we call system families, and just basically building up the core kind of structure of your building. Then we'll probably look at 3D, creating and modifying the smaller things or smaller elements. So doors, windows, and all different sorts of components. So furniture, we might look at lighting and different things there. Then we're going to look at documenting. So once we've got a 3D model, how we go about documenting that. So adding any annotations, details, all those little bits and pieces to get our drawings ready to be shared and published. And then the last 2 lessons, we're going to look at more like the presentation side of Revit. So firstly, appearance, so setting materials, graphics, rendering. And then hopefully in the last lesson, we'll look at some really cool ways to create different views that are pretty amazing and like surprisingly easy to do in Revit. I'm going to show you how to kind of set those up. So even with the most basic of models and only 5 or 6 lessons of kind of experience, you guys should be able to create some pretty amazing presentation drawings, diagrams, renders, and things like that, pretty much straight out of the box. So today's goals, first is to understand the fundamentals of Revit and BIM generally, which I'll discuss in a minute. Second, to familiarize ourselves with the user interface and navigation. So we're going to have a bit of a click around, and then we're going to start a new project with some basic elements, maybe some walls, a floor, roofs, and things like that. Into too much detail today because that's going to be the focus of next week's lesson. But I'm going to show you, and you can, after the lesson, literally follow my clicks and see how quickly and easily you can also start building up a Revit model. So BIM, this is kind of at the core of what Revit is and why it's so powerful and so widely used. So Revit is a tool to achieve BIM, which stands for Building Information Modeling. And it's a process where we design and make use of a 3D model with a heap of information in this model about pretty much anything. So anything about the building, about its products, its parts, maintenance of it, any sort of information we could possibly want to associate with the building itself. We can include all that information within the one model. It's all in the single file. And we can then use and share that with anybody. In the one model, you might typically have the architect as the head consultant managing and coordinating that model, but there'll be input from engineers, so structural, mechanical, electrical, hydraulic engineers, and any sort of consultants, so maybe a sustainability consultant. Everybody has input and is using the same model. So that means that everybody's working off the same information, which is amazing, and in the past has been a big issue. And this model is always live, so you're always working on a current model of exactly the current design and project. The kind of things we can use the BIM model for is beyond 3D. So here in the image, we can obviously see it's a 3D model, but we can also add time components to it. So we can add information about the construction sequencing. So we might have multiple phases or stages in our project. We've got 5D, which is costs. So we can add cost information about pretty much anything, right down from starting from excavation and fill works all the way to the cost of materials, quantifying how much concrete we're going to need or how many chairs we're going to need, and then quantify that and present that in a really clear way to our clients or the contractor or anybody else that might find that information useful. And then there's also 6D, which is facility management. So this is going beyond construction. So We spend all this time in design and documentation, building up this model with a whole heap of information in it. Now we don't actually need to lose that information. We can hang on to that and use that throughout the operation and life of the building. So a facility manager or somebody managing a building might be able to check the BIM model and, for example, to prompt them when they need to perform maintenance on certain equipment or plant, or to find the exact specifications on some part of the building that they may not have been able to in the past. The clash detection is a big one. So rather than starting construction on site and finding that there's big clashes, you can often now in Revit, it's quite easy to check that before you actually get out on site. So if there's a clash between structure and your architecture or your interior design, you can resolve that in the model, which is obviously a lot cheaper and faster. Energy analysis, structural analysis, and the list goes on. So Revit is the most powerful and versatile BIM design tool in the world, especially when it comes to making yourself more valuable in the workplace, given its increasing popularity as the industry standard. So it's key to remember that Revit's a tool to help you achieve BIM, and it's by far the most popular and widely used tool. But there are other alternatives out there that are also quite good, like ArchiCAD or Vectorworks and some of the others. But Revit's by far the most widely used, especially in Australia. And Revit can be used for designing, modeling, documenting, and managing buildings from concept design right through to construction and operation. So it's pretty much the full package. You can do everything just about that you'd ever want to in the field of architecture and interior design within Revit. And we can produce pretty much any drawing or analysis we'd want within the one program and straight out of the box. You don't need any extra add-ins or plugins or any other tools for that. All right, so I'm just going to give you a bit of an idea now of what you can do with Revit. So I showed you earlier just an image of this 3D model. So this is basically a 3D Revit BIM model with a bunch of information. And so all these components have information about what they are and their characteristics and their properties. So this roof, Revit knows that this red thing over our building is actually a roof. It's not grouping it as a wall or anything else. There's kind of smarts behind that, and I'll get into that a bit more later on. So you can produce from that your plans, your elevations, your sections, and all these are coming straight from the 3D model. So you're not having to reproduce these. As you build up that model, you can then choose to cut that model or slice or view it any way you like. And it's pretty much a live view of that 3D model. So then details, schedules. So if you've got Revit knows that we have, for example, if we take a look at this bar chair, we've given it a code here, and Revit can count in our project. Okay, you have 6 of these bar chairs, and you can pretty much present any information that you like in materials, dimensions, things like that. You can really easily present that in this schedule, and it's just pulling that information directly from the model. You don't need to manually enter any of this information. You pretty much create the schedule, and it'll present all that. And you can do this not just for furniture, but for any part of your project. It might be for walls, for a lighting schedule, fixtures schedule, floor finishes, whatever you like. You can produce your interior renders within Revit and your exterior renders, and then use it in some ways to create some really powerful presentation techniques, which we'll get to in probably the 5th or 6th lesson of this course. So in this case, we've got like a 3D section of a project. It's great for producing really clear documentation. So in here, you can imagine in the past, we typically have just elevations of our bathrooms, but just by adding a couple really simple 3D axes that are already in the project, we're not creating anything new. We're just selecting or slicing the project in a different way to present that to the contractor or the client. We can really clearly present our project and our concepts and pass that on. And then we can use it for different diagrams and more creative details. So you can, often Revit's thought of as a kind of a boring, purely documentation or drafting tool, but I'm going to show you how definitely a lot more than that. And you can use it from anything from the most radical conceptual models in your uni studies to pretty much detailing and documenting a real life project. And then you can really easily drop all those views onto sheets, as you can see here, and publish or export those to PDF or CAD files and share those. And a heap more, which we'll look at. So the user interface, and I've just fired up Autodesk Revit. If you don't have Revit installed yet, I recommend doing that sometime this week. If you've got any issues with getting it set up, or if something's missing, template, sample projects, some of the things we're going to discuss shortly, let me know and I'll help you get that set up, because it's quite important that you actually spend some time in Revit over the next 6 weeks. Before we start our own project, I'm going to just show you a little bit of the user interface by using this sample project. I'm just going to click this to open it. So here it is. This is pretty much exactly what your Revit should look like once you first fire up Revit 2019. I'm going to just do, before we do anything, I'm just going to make some quick changes that I recommend you make the same changes to your user interface. It's just going to make it a lot easier to see things and to work and avoid some mistakes. So the first thing we're going to do is just come over to the properties here and click and hold this properties window and drag it across to the right of the screen until we get this little rectangle blue box. And then I'm going to let that go. So I'm just going to bring that across to the right there. And then we're going to unclick this little drag elements on selection down here. The last thing is there's a few tabs with the interface before I run through it all. There's a few tabs up here that we don't really need, like the structure, steel, systems. So just to clean that up, I'm just going to go into File, Options, User Interface, and just untick all the structures and systems options. If you're not interested in energy analysis and tools within Revit, you can also untick that, but I'm going to leave that on for a second and hit OK. You can see that it's removed those from our tabs up the top in the ribbon. The user interface is actually quite useful and quite intuitive once you understand what everything is. Shouldn't be that overwhelming. So I'm going to start with the top. So we've got the ribbon across the top. So you can see here we've got a bunch of different tabs from architecture, insert, annotate, all the way through to precast. And this is what we're going to call the ribbon. To the left, we have our project browser. So you can see in here, this is everything that's in your project will show up here, whether it's a view or, I minimize this, a sheet, families, which we'll look at in a second. That's all in the project browser on the left. To the right, we have the properties, and this will update depending on what's selected. So if we select sheet, for example, it gives us the sheet properties there. If we select different views, it'll give us the properties. The properties will update accordingly there. Then in the middle, we've got our workspace. So let's start with the contextual ribbon, or the ribbon up top. I'm going to go to our 3D view. So I can come up to this up here and hit default 3D view. And this is that 3D model we were looking at earlier. We've got a few little shortcuts. This is called our quick access toolbar. And one last change I like to make is just click this little drop down and then click show below ribbon. So it's just brought that down, the quick access toolbar here. And what you can actually do is add any shortcut that you find or any tool that you're using over and over. Instead of having to search through these tabs or the ribbon to find it, you can add it to this quick access toolbar. And the way you do that is just by right-clicking the tool and then add to quick access toolbar, click that, and now you can see we've got that tool in here. All right, so the ribbon. Everything in here is pretty much sorted into these tabs, like I mentioned, from architecture right through to precast. And then there's sub-panels. So within architecture, we've got a build panel, we've got circulation panel, model, room and area, opening, data, work plane, and so on. So it's kind of grouped in a pretty neat way. And I'm just going to go through these one at a time, the key ones and the ones that you don't really need to worry about, because you can probably achieve about 80% of what you want in Revit with about 20%, I reckon, maybe even less than 20% of the tools. So we're going to focus on that 20%. We're not going to focus on, the 1% that you use once a year. Right now, we want to just get into Revit and use the key and most important tools. So in architecture, this is where you create everything in this tab is basically what you want to add to your 3D model. So it's either a solid thing. So you can see like walls, doors, windows, components, columns, roofs, ceilings, floors, ramps and stairs, or things like rooms and areas or openings. And so other things that are part of the 3D model. So this is where you're going to be doing probably 80% of what you're adding to your project is going to be in this architecture tab. You got the insert tab, which is basically to insert anything external from Revit. So you might have a CAD file or an image, or you might have modeled something in Rhino, for example, and you want to import that into Revit and use it. You'll find that in the insert tab. Then we've got the annotate tab. In the annotate tab, the opposite to the architecture tab. So the architecture tab, we said that everything in here is like a part of the 3D model, and it's basically visible in every view. In the annotate tab, these are all just 2D elements and they're view specific. So they're only going to show up in the view that you add them. So if I, for example, expand this and go to our level 1 floor plan and add, let's say, a dimension, click this and add this dimension here. That dimension is only visible in this floor plan. If I look at a 3D view or even our level 2 view, for example, you can see that dimension's not showing up there. It's because it came from the annotate tab, it's view specific and it's 2D. In here, some of the key tools you want to use is this align dimension is really pretty much going to do 99% of the dimension you need. And we've also got that shortcut in here on the quick access toolbar. So you can click that. You don't need to come to the annotate tab. You've got detail line as well. So if you ever want to just add lines to your project and not necessarily model the thing, you can always use detail line and region. So this is kind of like your hatch in AutoCAD or Rhino, where you just create a shape of some sort and then fill it with a suitable pattern. Text, obviously text annotations is another really big one. So you can create arrows or leaders with text to annotate your building like they've done in here. And then tagging is probably the last really important part of this. So finishes tags, materials tags, fixtures, fittings, tagging walls, things like that. This is where you can drop those tags onto your project like they've got here. You can see some door tags here, some window tags there. And that's pretty much it for the annotate tab. Analyze, you can almost completely ignore this if you're not interested in doing energy analysis or solar studies in Revit, but this is where you would come to do that. This tab, there's two parts to this. So the massing part and the site part. And the massing part is basically what we call conceptual massing. This is something you typically use really early on in the project, especially when you're trying to develop or model or sculpt some pretty abstract or unique kind of forms. So if you want, for example, slanted walls or some crazy parametric shapes, this is where you come to create that using in-place mass. But that's probably something you want to look at a little bit later on once you're a bit more comfortable with the fundamentals of Revit. And then the second part is the site part. For example, this topo surface here, this is where you can create a 3D topography or topo surface of your site. That can be based on a survey, or you can just kind of more freely sculpt that and add different levels and shape that. And then the rest of the tools in here are more to modify and manipulate that surface. The collaborate tab, at this stage, you can completely ignore this, but this is a tab that lets you share the model with others. So if you're working on a team in an office or sharing with consultants, this is where you can set up and manage how the model is shared and different access requirements and permissions. View, this is an important tab that we'll be using quite a bit. First and foremost, to create new views. So you can see in this panel here, we can create any view really quickly from this tab. So whether it be a 3D view, sections, callouts, plan views, which includes floor plans and ceiling plans, really important. Elevations, drafting views. You can just think of that as just a blank white canvas that doesn't look at your model, that you can then just draw. It's kind of separate to your model. So it's not going to view any part of your model. It's kind of just drawing lines or text or anything basically from the annotate tab can be added to a drafting view, but no model elements will ever appear or be able to be added to that view. Legends is similar to drafting view. We typically use that when we're going to place it on multiple sheets, like with symbols and things like that. Schedules we looked at in the preview. So basically to create some sort of, if you're not familiar with what a schedule is, it's basically just any list with information about some aspect of your project. We looked at a furniture schedule, but like I mentioned, you could do that for any part of your project. And also we can create sheets from in here. So once we've created all our views, we can create new sheets, and then we can literally drag and drop those onto sheets. The right part of this window is actually really important. I think some of these I recommend adding to your quick access toolbar. Close inactive is already there, but tile views, I might right click and add to quick access toolbar. And now we've got that in here. This just helps us tile. If we want to look at two views side by side, which I highly recommend, we can do that using the tile view. So for example, if I hit tile views now, it's going to be a little small because of the screen resolution, but you can see, you can have a look side by side at all the different views that we currently have open. We can then close some of these off. So if I close this one off and hit the little cross on level 1 as well, now that's a bit easy to work. And I recommend keeping, while you're starting off, it's really handy to keep the 3D view open on the side as you're working in a floor plan or an elevation or a section or any other 2D view for that matter on the left, just to see how your input and what your, basically your clicks, how your clicks are being reflected in 3D space, so that we're aware of height and how it's interacting with other objects. The other part to the view tab, the other two parts, we've got graphics here to the left, and this is something that you typically don't really need to worry about. In an office, it'll typically be managed by a BIM manager or somebody that's managing Revit in your office. The template out of the box is a pretty good starting point that you probably don't need to worry about the graphics too much until a little bit later on. And this one here, we've got presentation as well. So where we can render in the cloud or look at the render gallery, which is pretty much a gallery of all your cloud renders. This is another part of the project that is typically taken care of by a BIM manager in an office. But starting off in Revit, there are a couple tools that you want to definitely become familiar with and manage yourself. One of those is materials. So if I click this, for example, it's just going to bring up our material browser. And you can see in here we have a range of different materials that we can use and apply to pretty much any object in our project. Clicking those, we'll see there's already quite a few materials that are preloaded into Revit. You can also add more that you get from Autodesk, but you can also download a bunch of materials online or create your own. And we might even get to that a little later on in the course. Cancel that. The next one is object styles. If I click this, this is where you want to come if you want to manage or control things like your line weights or surface patterns. This is where you can control that. So you can control line weights, line colors, line patterns, and materials for different categories. So I'm going to just pause here for a second because this here is an important part of Revit that I think is worth explaining earlier on and a little bit more a little later on down the track. You can see here we've got this categories column, and there's pretty much a bunch of different categories down here that Revit, that's already preset in Revit. This can't be changed. And this is basically how Revit organizes your project. So you've got every category that you could think of in an architectural or a building project, from ceilings, columns, doors, floors. We've got site, including surface or trees and things like that you might put in here. Well, that might go into planting, walls, windows. And so these are the Revit categories. Any object that you create in Revit, when you're using the architecture tab and you click wall, it's automatically adding that object or that element to the walls category. So then when you decide to schedule that, for example, or when you decide to view only your walls in the project, Revit knows, and it's kind of grouping and organizing your project in a really neat way and letting you control the presentation or the visibility of each category from one place, and that one place is right here. So rather than having to set your line weight or making sure that things are on the right layers, you can just come in here and set a line weight. So the higher the number, the thicker the line weight, and we'll have a look later on at what those line weights actually are exactly. But you can basically come in here and set your line weights for projection, which is when you're looking at it kind of front on and not cutting through it. Your cut lines, which is obviously going to be a bolder line or a wider line. You can set the line color. You can set the line pattern. So currently it's solid, but you can choose from any sort of dashed line or any type of line pattern you want there. And you can set a default material so that your walls, by default, unless you override it or specify a specific material, you can give it a default material in here as well. And you can also, so that's the model objects, but you can also do that for annotation objects. So remember, model objects are what we talked about, everything in the architecture tab. So these are the 3D elements that are showing up in our 3D model, and basically in any view that we cut in our model, they will show these model objects. Whereas annotation objects, these are the 2D elements. So it's mostly like, you know, our tags, dimensions, text, things like that. We can also control how they appear throughout our project. Materials, object styles. The last bit in here that you really want to look at is location. So we're going to set the actual location of the project. The main benefit of that, outside of energy analysis and retrieving climate data and using that in your energy tests, is the shadows that it's going to project. So it knows the exact location of your project, really easily set a specific date and time of the year, and Revit can project pretty much the exact shadow. So it's really handy, not just for presentation because it looks cool, but it's really handy for shadow diagrams and doing like sort of sun studies and things like that. And that's probably all we really need to worry about right now in the Manage tab. Add-ins, these are kind of extensions to Revit. There's a bunch that Revit comes with out of the box, depending on your download and your version. You can also, there's quite a few extensions and plugins out there that can also make your life a bit easier, but you don't really need any of those, especially when you're starting off. You can probably look at that a little bit later on down the track. Quantification, we can ignore this. This is more for you QSs or quantity surveyors to actually do really accurate calculations. Pretty much all the calculations that we want to do or quantify in our project, we can do that through the schedule tool. So we won't need that. Site designer, this one also, so this is kind of an extension for site modeling. So again, we can probably ignore this. We can do most of the things we need to do from the Massey and Site tab. And the Modify tab, this one is a really important tab, along with Architecture, Insert, Annotate, and View. So the last really important one for now is the Modify tab. And this is basically where you can modify or manipulate anything that's already in your project. So anything, once we create a wall or a roof or any sort of element, when we want to modify it, copy it, rotate it, move it, scale it up, cut it in some way, that we can do that all from the Modify tab. And this is something that comes up regardless of whether you're modifying a wall or a roof or text. You're going to get the same modify options, and they all work in the same way. So it's a panel that's really worth familiarizing yourself with. And the last one here is the Precast tab, which is more for precast panels, but we probably don't need to look at that. So if we go to, let's say, Massey and Site, and we're looking for a specific tool, but we don't know exactly what it does, we can hover our mouse over the tool. You can see it gives you firstly a basic text description, but then it also loads an image with a bit more of a description. You can hit F1 for more help on how to use that tool. But I find that this is a really good way to start. I recommend everybody, if you've got the time and the chance, literally go through every single tool in this ribbon. Just hover over the tool and let Revit load up its description with an image. Some of them will also load a video. So if we go to the Modify tab, for example, and we look at, let's say, rotate, hover over that, and let this load up an image, and then it's going to load, you can see that video there. So I was showing the basic clicks. So you're selecting something, then you're placing a point, and then you're placing a start rotation point and an end rotation point, and Revit takes care of the rest. So that's a really handy tool. I recommend especially doing it for the Modify tab. Just hover over each of these in the Modify tab and the Modify sub-panel in here, just to see how all these work. If you can do it for the whole ribbon, it's really going to help you. Obviously, you're not going to retain everything the first go, but to familiarize yourself with what the possibilities are within Revit and where it's going to make it a lot easier to find things in the future. Okay, so that's it for the ribbon. The ribbon is where you use to create anything and everything in your project, and any tool that you need will be in the ribbon. You don't need to look anywhere else in your screen. It's always going to be somewhere up the top. To the left, back to the project browser, I mentioned this is like kind of your contents page or an index of your project, and it's grouped in these categories here. So we've got views, legends, schedules, sheets, families, groups, and Revit links. The first and probably most important one is views. If we expand that by hitting the little cross, we can see in here that It's basically every view that's currently in our project. If we go to the View tab and create a new view, section, for example, and click from here to there, just keep an eye on the section. The section's part of the project browser on the left. As soon as I drop this, you can see it's added that section 1 in there. This is just a live update. As you add, you don't really need to modify this in any way unless you want to rename anything, which you can right click, rename, let's call it section 8A if we want to change the name like that. But otherwise, you can, this Revit will just sort that for you and keep it in a pretty nice and neat way, sorted by views. I'm going to minimize this. Schedules, currently there's furniture schedule in here. So if I double click this, we can see this is the furniture schedule, and we can modify this if we like. Sheets. Let me just tab views for a second. Note as I'm opening views, by the way, that they're all just getting tabbed across the top by default. So if I go back into my views and open level 1, you can see it's opening here, but the others are also open in the background. So if I double click this 3D sectional perspective, for example, Revit's just adding that to our tab views up the top. If we wanted to tile views now and have a look at this 3D view alongside our level 2 plan, if I hit the tile views straight off the bat, it's going to just tile all 5 of those windows, right? So if I just show you what it does, so it's tiled all 5 of those windows, and that's not really useful. It's not what we're after. So if I hit tab views back up here, it's going to bring that back. And what we want to do is click close inactive views, which we also have a shortcut up here on the close inactive windows or the quick access toolbar. So if we click that, you can see that it's closed all those windows or tabs that were in the background. So now we've got just the 1 view open. So now I've got just the 2 open. And then if I hit tile views, we can now see both of those views side by side and work in one and see how those changes are reflected in the other. So I'll minimize that for a sec. I'm just going to hit tab views again to bring this back up. So we've got just back to our project browser, sheets. If we double click any one of these, it opens up a sheet. And this has already got some views dropped onto here. We've got some renders, a schedule, some images, and a title block. And we can flick through these and have a look at some of the different sheets in our project. One note about sheets and views in Revit is that you can only drop a view on a sheet once. So let's take this south elevation, for example, which is already on our sheet A103. This is already on this sheet. If we go to another sheet, let's say our plan sheet, and I expand views, and we look for under elevations and south, and I click, hold, and drag it over to the sheet, and then release the mouse, it's going to give us this warning that this view is already placed on sheet A103, It says to place a similar view on a sheet, you can use the duplicate view or duplicate with detailing command to create a copied view. So you can only place a view on a sheet once. So what we need to do, I'm going to firstly just select this and delete it by hitting backspace on the keyboard. So I've deleted it off the sheet, but not from the project. And if we go back to this view now, for example, say we do want to add the south elevation to this view, we just need to select it in the project browser, click and hold down the left mouse button, and then drag it across, and then let go of the mouse. And you can see there it's giving us the outline of that view. And then we can click wherever we want to place it. So I'm going to just place it there for now. So this view now, it's still linked to the project. So if we go back to the south elevation and make any changes, so for example, I'm just going to select all these grid lines and the trees maybe, and right click and go hide in view elements. So I've just hidden those from the view. If we go back to our sheet, we can see that it's hidden there. So this is still linked to that view. So I can make changes in this south elevation view, and I don't really need to worry about the sheet that it's being updated, because I know that it's going to be updated exactly as per my changes here. We can also make changes from the sheet though. So if I don't want to be going through the project browser and looking for my view and opening it from there to make the changes, you can come to the sheet if you know which sheet it's on. So if we come to this A102, and then you can just double click on the viewport, You can see that it's grayed everything else out. So it's grayed our title block out as well as all the other views on the sheet. Whereas you can see that this is all still kind of active and able to be selected. So we're now basically, this is exactly the same as double clicking south elevation here and making a change here. You can work in both of those. So I might just close inactive, open the south elevation there and hit tile views just to show you what I mean. So if we grab this window, for example, in here, you can see that it's selected in there as well. And if I open up our 3D view, clicking here, select this window, you can see that it's also selected in there. So that we'll look at selection in a second, but when it's blue, it means it's selected. And if I make any change in here, so let's say I just nudge it to the right a bit, that's reflected in the 3D model. And if I click our plans, our sheet, it's also moved there. If I delete it, it's deleted from the view, from the sheet, and from the 3D model. They're all kind of linked. So you can work in whichever view is most comfortable for yourself. And I recommend, like, again, as I mentioned, keeping the 3D view open on the side and working in that either in a plan view, elevation section, or a 2D view to the left. So last little bit in the project browser that's really important for now is the family section. So if I expand that, you'll notice these are pretty much all the categories that we looked at in the object styles. So when we looked at manage object styles, we can see here that there's pretty much all the categories that we had in here with a couple extras. But these are basically showing us every family or every object that's loaded into this current project or into this template in this case. And this is really important also for understanding like Revit's hierarchy and how Revit organizes things. So if we look at walls, for example, and I expand this, we can see that in the walls category, we have 1, 2, 3 different families. This next level is called families. And then if we expand those families, we can see we've got quite a few different types. So we'll look at that in a bit more detail next week when we look at walls and roofs and floors in a bit more detail. But just understand that there's some sort of organizing structure that goes from like a higher level to a more detailed level, and that it's quite important to the way that you manage your project. So that's pretty much it for the project browser. Over to the right, we've got the properties. And if we select any object, the roof in this case, we can see that these properties update. And there's 2 types of properties in Revit. So the first type is our instance property. So this roof now being selected, I've got the properties that I can see here. If I change any of those, for example, this extrusion start or end or an offset or something like that, it's going to affect only this one single object that we have selected. Same with this window. If I select this window here, if I change anything here, let's say, for example, the sill height, and I make the sill height, let's say -200 and hit apply, you notice that just came down a tiny bit. So right now it's sitting, see our elevation as well, it's sitting about 200 mil below that one or below the level, but it's only affected this window here. And that's why this is the instance property. So it's specific to the element or the elements that you have selected. If we go into the second type or the other type of properties, which is the type properties, by clicking edit type up here, this gives us, it's going to make this a little bit smaller. This gives us a bunch of other properties that affect this window type throughout the project. So right now we're on the single window family, the standard type, and we've got a bunch of different options here that we can play around with. So I'm just going to change one of these, perhaps frame width might be an obvious one. So you can see the frame width currently it's 60 mil here. If I change this to something ridiculous, like say 200 mil and really thicken up and hit apply, notice that change affected not just the window that I have selected, but the other window here because it's of the same type. So if I hit OK and just orbit around our model, see if there's any others. You can see these also, because they're of the same type, also get updated accordingly. So we'll get into a bit more detail on that next week. So the last little bit with the interface is, I'll just tab the views again. Tab views. Last part of the interface I want to talk about is down the bottom here, where we've got basically all our graphic options. So you can set scales in here. Clicking this, you can change the scale of your view. You can change the detail level of the view. You can change the visual style. So by clicking this, we can change it to say hidden line, shade it white, or say wireframe, in cases you might want to look at your building kind of in X-ray mode so you can see lines and things beyond. Set that back to shaded. We can turn shadows on and off by toggling this button. We've got the render button. We can play with our crops and a few other things. So these are all kind of view-specific visual controls that you have, or graphic controls that you have down here, which we'll look at. And that's pretty much it for the interface. There's a couple parts to it. In the middle is obviously your workspace. I recommend setting it up in this way, and you'll find that it's a pretty good way to work, and it'll make it a bit easier to find things and navigate, especially when you're starting off. Let me just switch back to the slideshow for a second. And we're going to look at navigation. So there are a couple things, switching back here, that Revit's a little bit different to some other tools. And I just want to highlight which keys on the keyboard are really important and how to use your mouse. And I'm going to do that in the 3D view. It all applies the same in the 2D view, but the 3D view kind of covers everything. So the first on your keyboard is the tab button. So the tab button basically cycles through, and when you want to select something, it just cycles through different objects near where the cursor is. So if we hover over here, for example, we've got the tree here. We've also got this wall, and we've got a roof kind of intersecting in a similar kind of spot. If I was trying to select here the wall, and it's not letting me select it, it's selecting the roof. And I can see that next to the cursor. Once you hover over, it's telling me it's roof category, basic roof family, and it was SG metal roof type. If I don't want to select that, I just hit tab, and it's going to cycle through all the different things in that area. Another way to look at it, if it's not giving you next to your cursor the description of what's about to be selected, if you look down the bottom left corner of the screen, that's going to give you an update of, as I hover over different things, of what's about to be selected. Okay, so that's the first thing. The tab key is really important. The next thing is Control and Shift. So when we're making selections, if I click, for example, this tree, and I want to add some things to that selection to make some modification to all of them, if I hold down Control, you can see it gives us a little plus sign. Now I can hover over the tree, wait for that little pop-up to come up, make sure I'm picking the right tree, and click with the left mouse button. Same thing, holding down Control, click. Now I've got 3 trees in my selection. I can see that up here as well. Planting 3. I can also see that if I click the filter up here, which we'll look at later on, there's planting 3 objects selected. And then to subtract things from your selection, the Shift key is also very important. So holding down Shift and clicking to remove those from the selection. That's pretty much, they're the main keys on the keyboard. With the mouse, it's quite simple. So left click is to select. If I left click anything, it's just going to select it. You can see the properties updating accordingly. We've always got a right click option. So right click's really handy for selecting things as well and getting some extra features. And then you've got the mouse wheel. So if I'm scrolling up now, it's zooming in. Scrolling down on the mouse, zooms out of the view. And if ever I want to zoom extents, I can double click the mouse wheel and it zooms the full extent. So if I'm zoomed right in and I really want to quickly just zoom out to see the overall model or the overall view, if I double click the mouse wheel, it instantly brings us back here. Panning, last thing, with the mouse wheel, holding down the mouse wheel, you can see it's now added the crosshair or the cursor. And if I move this around now, I can move around in our view to see different things. So if I'm zoomed in and I want to move around the model, I just hold down the mouse wheel and then move that mouse and it's dragging it around. And zoom, scroll up to zoom in, scroll down to zoom out. The last thing is in the 3D view to orbit around your model, to kind of orbit around in 3D space. So this only applies to 3D views, not to 2D views. You can firstly select the object you want to orbit around, and then click the mouse wheel and hold it down, then click and hold Shift and then just move your mouse in a direction. You can get a nice smooth 3D view of your project. You can do a lot of this using this cube as well. So have a look at this and also this little drop down and have a click around and see how all those different tools affect your view of your project. Right, so that's pretty much it for navigation. Last thing we're going to do is start a project really quickly in a couple minutes. So go back here. I'm going to just hit File and Close to close off this project, and I'm not going to save it. And to create a new project, once you start Revit, you should all have this architectural template up here, and you just need to click that, and it's basically create a new project with the basic architectural template. If I click the 3D view up here, there's nothing physical 3D modeled in here. It's just giving us some references. So we have ground floor and a level 1, which we can adjust and play around with. And there's a few different views. So we've got some floor plan views, some ceiling plan views in here, a default 3D view, some elevations, and so on. And there's a few families that are loaded out of the box. So we've got some different families that we can add to the project. First thing to do when you create a new project is to just save it. So if you go to File, Save As, Project, and just save it in a folder somewhere and give it obviously a meaningful name. And good Revit practice is to also add the version to the name. So perhaps underscore 2019 or 2025, depending on your Revit version. And the reason for that is that Revit is not backwards compatible. So if you've got a project in Revit 2019, you will not be able to open that project in an earlier version. That's really important because it works the other way around. So if you've got a project in an older version, let's say 2017, you can open it in Revit 2019, but what Revit will do is it will upgrade that model. And then if you decide to save it, then it's no longer available to older versions. So that's something to be mindful if you're working between, say, your own computer and a work computer or a university computer. You typically want to be working on the oldest version of Revit that you have if you really do need to be switching different computers and using Revit in different places. Otherwise, you won't be able to access it. So once we've saved that, we can then, first thing we want to do is go into Manage tab and Project Information and just populate some of this information in here. So we might, in the Others section, set project status, we might say BD, maybe SK, like sketch design, client name, project address. Click these 3 buttons and add project name, proposed, and project number. And this might be your own number or your office number, and put something in there. So this is just good practice to get this done, because what Revit will do is it will take this information and it will put it on all our sheets wherever we have a spot for client name or for project address or any of this information. Revit will pull that information from here and present that on the sheet as it's entered in here. I'll just hit OK there. And the last thing before we start modeling in terms of setting up our project is to set the location. So again, in the Manage tab, we set the location, which we mentioned earlier, and we can find a specific address. You can type in a specific address in here and then hit search, or you can just search kind of roughly. So over here, Australia. It's giving you some options here. Did you mean Perth, Australia? Yeah. And you can zoom in and move this pin to a specific address. But to be honest, for most purposes, if you're in the right city, it's going to be accurate enough to project the correct shadows and things like that and collect the right climate data. You can drag this and place it anywhere you like. So let's say there, for example. If we're happy with that, we can just hit OK. And that's it. Once we turn shadows on and start playing with our lighting and shadows or doing any energy analysis, Revit's going to pull all that information from Autodesk servers, and it's going to project the right shadows for our project. So I'm just going to spend another 2 minutes just to quickly show you how to add some things to your project and what I want you to kind of play around with in the next 7 days. So I've got the ground floor plan and the 3D view open here, selected and double click. So if we want to open level 1, you can double click that. We can see it's opened up here, and we can see that it's bold in here, which means that it's the active view. So I want you to open up the ground floor and the 3D view. Then I want you to come into view and hit tile views. And then come into views and just double click the mouse wheel just to zoom extents, and then same here, double click the mouse wheel just to zoom and see everything. And I want you to just pretty much try and explore everything from within the architecture tab. So I'm going to use wall as an example for now, but I want you to come through and try wall, doors, windows, components, and try and add a few of these different things. Probably don't need to worry about these three: curtain system, curtain grid, and mullion just yet. But everything up to stairs, basically try and click those and add those, whether in ground floor or 3D view, and just make some clicks and see how that's actually updating your 3D model. So we're here in the architecture tab, click wall. And the first thing you'll notice when you click any tool is that the ribbon turns green and that you get an extra line of options and settings down here. And you'll get, if we look down the bottom left, you'll get a hint as to what you need to do. So I was saying click to enter wall start point. This is another really good tip, along with hovering over a tool to let Revit show you, it'll give you a bit of tip of how to use that tool. The bottom left-hand corner of the screen is really handy for that. So click to enter wall start point, and that'll be obviously relevant to whichever tool you've selected. And the last thing that's changed is the properties here. So you can see in the properties that's now become the wall properties. If I click this, we can pick different wall types. So let's say we want this brick 230. We click that, and we can change settings in here if we want now. So we can change the base. For example, do you want it to start at ground floor or somewhere else? Let's leave it at ground floor. And the top constraint, for example, do we want it to be unconnected? So go all the way up to 8 meters, or do we want to constrain the top to level 1? Yeah. Note that in Revit, there are a lot of different ways to do things. This option here, for example, we can change it here, but we can also change it up here. So we can also go height unconnected. You can see that it's updating both. So there are a lot of different ways to access things. Rendering is another example. So we've got rendering down here in the view, the little teapot, but you can also access it from here, from view, and click render up there. So that's pretty much the same for every tool. When you click any tool, it's going to do that. It's going to put you in the modify tab. It's going to turn this green. It's going to give you some options. It's going to give you a hint in the bottom left corner, and it's going to give you the properties here, which you can modify before or after you actually place your element. So with this selector now, we don't really need to change any of these options. We can just start clicking, and we might do it in the plan view. I can choose here which way I want to draw. So I'm just going to keep the line selected for now, and then just make some clicks in here. We can see that as I'm clicking in 2D space, that this is also updating in the 3D model. We can also do it in 3D view. So let's say for doors, if I click door, notice when I hover over a wall, you can see that door there. If I'm hovering over space, it won't let us place a door because a door obviously needs to be located within a wall, as do windows. I can place doors in here. You can see that there. It's being added in the 3D view as I left click in our 2D view. But I can also come over here if I click 3D view and place in 3D view as well. And both ways work perfectly fine. There's no, when you're starting off, I think working whichever way is more comfortable. Let's say here I want to change the size of the window. I can click here and let's pick this one here. And then same thing again. We can come in here and place in your 3D view so that at different heights, for example, or we can do it in the plan view and set a specific sill height. So if it's here, let's say 2 meters, place this there. You can see it's placed that window at 2 meters. I click it, you can see that it's 2 meters above the ground floor level. So have a play around with that, with all those tools. Have a play around with the navigation. Definitely hover over each of the tools to get a bit of an idea of what they all do. And we'll go into a lot more detail on how to create exactly what you want and the exact location, the type that you want next week for all those. Before we go, I just want to recap on a couple fundamentals. The first is to keep in mind that what we're doing in Revit is that we're creating one really detailed and accurate, integrated and coordinated 3D model from which we can extract essentially any view or information that we like. It's really important that we create a solid, proper model If we do that right, we can then use it in so many different ways that saves us a lot of time and gives us a really clean model with relevant drawings and information that would take much longer to do it any other way. So there are model elements and detail elements. Remember, the model elements, pretty much everything in the architecture tab that we looked at, and they're part of the 3D model and they show up in all views. You can override that and hide them if you want individually, but generally it's part of the 3D model, so it will show up in all views where you're looking at that element. And the second type of elements are detail elements, and they're pretty much everything in the annotate tab. Remember that they're view specific 2D elements, so they show up only in that view in which you add them. So your text, your dimensions, your tags, things like that. Third is the Revit hierarchy. So at the top level, we've got our project, which includes everything, includes all our families, every different type of basically object or thing that we have is loaded into the project. So you can download families and things online, but to use them in your project, you need to actually load them into your project and they become a part of the project from which you can use them. The next level down, so inside your project, everything is sorted into a category. We saw walls, floors, doors, furniture, text, things like that. Revit groups that into a category. Then within each category, got a family. So a family, think of it as like they have some similarity. For example, in your doors category, you might have a single swinging door family, you might have a double swinging door family, and you might have a sliding door family. So it's like the general design or type of that door. So it's a grouping of objects, basically. And then the last is the type. For example, in your project, you might have, in the door category, you have a single door family, but then you might have 10 different types, which they vary only by size. So you might have a 900 wide by 2100 high. Then you might have a 1 meter wide by 2100 high, and so on. So you can have as many different types as you like. And the last point is the parameters and information in everything. So pretty much everything that we saw there in the properties that we changed, whether it was in the instance properties or after we clicked edit type and had some properties in there, they're all parameters and information that we can then draw that out. For example, the sizes in some of those things or the level in which they're located. Anything that's pretty much typed in Revit or modeled in Revit has within it this sort of inherent information. And that information is linked throughout the project. And that's what we call this coordinated 3D model. It's as close as you can get to building. And lastly, today's top tips. So before you get started, so fire up Revit. I recommend customizing your user interface as I showed in the beginning. So rearranging the windows and clicking a couple of things off to clean it up a little. Then customize your quick access toolbar. This is something that you'll be doing as you go along. So as you find you're using certain tools over and over, you can add those to the quick access toolbar just to make it a little easier to work and save yourself some time and headaches trying to find the right tool for the job. Third point, you don't need to model everything. So this is really important. You could, because of the power of Revit and the versatility of it, you could theoretically model a building right down to like an infinite amount of detail, like right down to the last screw, but it would take you quite a long time and you need to ask like, is it worth it and why do I need to do that? If there's a part of your project that you don't need to ever render, you don't need to ever schedule it, you only need it to show up in one view, and it's quite complex, it might be worthwhile just drawing it with detail lines or with some sort of filled region, the shape and hatch pattern that we looked at. So you might be able to use anything like that from the annotate tab rather than adding a 3D object to your model and try to get that looking perfect. That also has the advantage that it keeps your model a bit lighter. So just adding a few lines might be a lot easier than modeling something really complex that kind of adds or slows down your model when it's really not being used and you're not pulling that much value from that part of your project. And especially when starting off, you can also theoretically use Revit like AutoCAD. So basically just drawing every single line rather than adding 3D objects. I mean, it would be crazy to do that. But if you really did need to and it was urgent to smash a certain drawing out, you've always got that option. You can always resort to annotations, so lines and filled regions and just making things right with text and things like that without modeling it. But I'm going to show you how to model pretty much everything so you do have an accurate and coordinated BIM model, which is where you get the real value of Revit. Fourth, explore the sample projects in the library. It's a really basic project, but it'll give you an idea of the different views and how you can use Revit. and create your project. Fifth tip, work in multiple views. So I showed you how to open up a plan view or a 2D view and a 3D view alongside it. And I highly recommend doing that, especially in the beginning. If you've got multiple monitors, even better. You can expand, for example, your 3D view, full screen it on one of your screens, and then be working and clicking around in a 2D view on your other screen. But that's really handy to understand how the program works. And the last point is just to breathe and think before clicking. So I showed you a few of the different places that there are clues and hints in Revit. The bottom left-hand corner will always give you a bit of a hint or a clue to the tool that you're currently in or what you need to be doing and clicking. Hovering over the tools will also do that and give you an overview of the tool. The sample project is another one that's got a lot of tips and hints in there. One of the biggest things that I think can help beginners or somebody starting off in Revit understand and be comfortable with the tool is just taking your time and thinking about what you're actually trying to do rather than hurrying and clicking. Revit's not that kind of program. It's the kind of program where you want to sort of relax, have a think about what you want to do, and have a look around the whole screen, because there is a lot on that screen. We went through the user interface. There is quite a bit to it. Usually if you properly check everything out, it'll make it a lot easier to make the right clicks the first time and save you headaches and frustration, and also making certain mistakes that might cost you a lot more time and effort and energy later on. So that's pretty much it. I hope that was helpful to everyone. I know we covered quite a bit today, starting from the basics of BIM, looking at the user interface and starting a project really quickly. I think in 6 weeks, we will absolutely make some great progress where most of you are creating some pretty complete projects and having touched on every part of Revit that you really need to be worrying about and understanding at this stage.